Hello, and today we are talking about Amadeo Bordiga's brief 1957, I believe, piece, Aircraft Carrier Imperialism. Um, this particular version is available free on Libcom. It's translated from a Spanish translation of the Italian. It's not translated from the Italian directly, so we have to take that in mind. This is from Il Comunista. It was republished in 1999 and translated into English in 2006. Just something to note. I'm reading because I'm hard on Bordiga, like the central text of Bordigism, which is the Leon thesis. I'm coming down pretty hard, as you'll see in that series. So I want to read some pieces that get to why I still find Bordiga to be such an important figure for Marxists to deal with, even if you reject what makes his form of Leninism unique. Anyway, so Amadeo Bordiga examines the significance of sea power and modern imperialism after the decline of land-based feudal empires of Europe. The rise of the Portuguese imperialism with the conquest of the Indian Ocean trade routes in the 15th and 16th century, the decisive role played by naval supremacy in the world wars, and its culmination in contemporary nuclear aircraft strike force, the terror of the world as the global spearhead of the long reach of American imperialism in this 1957 installment of the Thread of Time series. Now, this would have been published without his name on it initially because Bordiga did not generally sign his pieces. That leads to some misattribution of things to him too. We'll get to that later. The Thread of Time, Aircraft Carrier Imperialism, Bordiga. Imperialism, in its most general aspect, is a conquest and rule over political and economic entities by a supreme central state power, is not a phenomenon that pertains exclusively to capitalism. Number one, that's important. That's very important. All right. Disregarding their social contents, their numerous types of the same historical phenomenon, an Asian imperialism, a Greco-Roman imperialism, a feudal imperialism, and finally a capitalist imperialism. So Bordiga is still insisting on kind of simple historical materialist schemata here. So we're going to kind of complicate that later, but I think this is important. As revolutionary workers, we are the most interested in the substantial differences that distinguish capitalist imperialism from his historic predecessor, that is, feudal imperialism. And the imperialism that actually early Marxists were still fighting against, right? That's something that we have to remind ourselves. In the 19th century, when Marxists are saying we need to complete the bourgeois revolution, it wasn't a metaphor, it was literal. And it wasn't in a teleological sense. There were still feudal states in existence that they were contending with. Always keeping in mind that we are abstracting from other basic differences, feudal imperialism and capitalist imperialism are the most noticeably distinguished by the fact that one was manifest in state structures that held the basis in territories and land, while the other emerged in a historical stage above all as world domination founded on naval hegemony and therefore on the domination of the great ocean trade routes. By the way, this is important. This is why I talk about Peter Zion and all that focus on the kind of liberal neo-realist on blue water trade as the mechanism of global capitalism and globalization. And retreating from blue liberal trade is a Hadrian's walling of the empire. If you understand what Bordiga's seeing here in 1957, you start to see what is going on. This is also actually, interestingly, what people like Dubin and certain Russian reactionaries are responding to in their whole sea power versus land power debates. Right? Under feudalism, a state power that enjoys a land-based military superiority could play an imperialist role. Under capitalism, on the other hand, which is a mode of production that has led to unprecedented levels of commodity production and expanded beyond the limits of credibility, the phenomenon of mercantilism that had already been stirred up in the preceding modes of production, imperialism is connected to naval supremacy, which today means naval air supremacy. And naval air supremacy is key. Capitalist imperialism, above all, hegemony on the world market. Capitalist imperialism is above all hegemony on the world market. In order to conquer this hegemony, however, it's not enough to possess a small industrial powerful industrial machine and territory that ensures the raw supply of materials. It's not enough just to be a productive force. You cannot just be a productive force and be the hegemon. What is needed is an immense navy and merchant fleet. That is, the means by which the great intercontinental trade routes can be controlled. The Blue World Trade System that I've been talking about for a year and a half. For history shows that the succession of imperialist supremacy is strictly linked in the realm of capitalist mercantilism to the succession of naval supremacy. The decline of the Venetian Republic, which had arisen to great power and splendor during the age of the Crusades, see my episode with Anan Hussein on the Mediterranean world, where I talk a lot about this, commenced with the loss of monopoly over the trade between Asia and Europe. Previously, the trade between the continents in the part that followed a sea route, that is the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and in part an overland route, the Silk Road. For there was no Suez Canal across the Isthmus of Suez, so it was necessary to transfer commodities by ships that docked in ports of the Egyptian coast to the Red Sea to wagons and then barges that took them to the Mediterranean ports, among which Alexandria was predominant. That's important. This is that Mediterranean world we were talking about in the Anan Hussein episode. Again, I want to give Bordiga a lot of key here because they give him a lot of flack on some of his theories, but on this, he's a penetrative thinker and he can sum this stuff up very quickly. The discovery of America made Portugal and Spain the masters of vast colonial empires, and the first in the history of modern imperialism. See Alan Milton's Wood for why these empires don't end up being capitalistic exactly, and also Robert Brenner, but we'll come back to that. It's beyond the scope of this paper by Bordiga. True predecessors of the U.S. type of imperialism, the Portuguese did not concern themselves with occupying vast territories, but were focused on the most part of seizing control over the bottlenecks and choke points of world trade. In the context of such a grandiose plan, it was indispensable to seize hegemony over the Indian Ocean, which was a bridge between the two most highly developed continents at the time, Europe and Asia. Although it's always been interesting to me that we needed a bridge between Europe and Asia since they're basically one megacontinent. Anyway. Thus, starting from the colony at Cape Verde, conquered to the beginning of the 16th century, the Portuguese got their hands on Ceylon and Malacca, and penetrated as far south as the Sunda archipelago, Sunda archipelago, and then reached China, where they occupied Macau. But the fatal blow to the Venetian supremacy was only finally dealt by the Portuguese occupation of the island of Socotra and the Straits of Hormuz, situated in the entrances to the Red Sea and to the Persian Gulf, respectively. The old sea land routes of the European-Asian trade were therefore severed, and the ships that attempted to run the Portuguese blockade were mercilessly attacked and sunk. Finally, the Venetian Republic and the Sultan of Egypt, in order to defend their common interest, formed an alliance against the new masters in the Indian Ocean, but the Allied fleet was defeated at the Battle of Dubin in 1590. And I love about this period of Bordiga's writing is he really goes into the deep history that most Marxists today ignore. Like they treat anything before the French Revolution or the English Civil War as kind of here be dragons. All right. Marx talks about it, but only in vague, broad strokes. Bordiga goes into detail. The final result was the battle was an intercontinental trade, which turned towards the Atlantic trade routes, which led Lisbon to become the center of world trade and the capital of the greatest imperialist power of the epoch, while Alexandria rapidly declined. The Venetian Republic, despite its formidable blow it suffered, would survive for many years, but its imperialist supremacy was a thing of the past. Subsequent history did not vary from this pattern of development. It shows that bourgeois imperialism is naval imperialism because its realm is the world market. So when you see the land-based arguments from like Dubin, they want stable empires that are basically feudal, which are land-based conquerings. Like there's implications in what they're saying is kind of is what they want is like their vision of multipolarity is almost neo-feudal in its orientation. Now they don't think you can turn back the clock, but nonetheless, that's what they're focused on. This is big in Eurasianist thinking, not just in weird right-wingers like Dubin. All right, back to the text. Whoever possesses world hegemony of Z-power is equipped for hegemony over the domains of the world trade, which is the real basis for capitalist imperialism. This is why, according to Bordiga, the Maoist inversion of imperialism as the primary contradiction versus capitalism as the primary contradiction leads imperialism itself flourishing. The two world worlds provide an imperialism that relies on land armies and inevitably yields to the imperialism that based on naval power. Twice, land-based powers on the scale of the Central Powers and Nazi fascist Axis faced off against Anglo-Saxon powers, which enjoyed air and naval supremacy, and twice the land-based powers were totally defeated. For the Second World War, displayed a new aspect. This aspect, however, is explained by the age-old laws of the development of imperialism. For not only were land-based powers thoroughly defeated, but one of the powers on the winning side, Great Britain, also emerged vanquished from the vast struggle. The end of the British Empire is really culminated in the resettlement of World War II. Someone told me, if how would Churchill feel about my comments about agency once, when I said that people who cannot fight by themselves do not have agency as a nation. Well, they lost their empire, so they didn't have a lot of. They lost their empire despite winning, so that tells you how much empire agency they did still have, and not due to the destruction ever inflicted by its enemy, but because of the superior naval and commercial power of its more powerful ally, America. For Britain, the Second World War, with regard to its effects on the worldwide balance of sea power, must represent what the Battle of Dux represented for the Venetian Republic. For it cannot be said that Britain was destroyed. Its naval superiority and its hegemony was definitely annihilated. The deterioration of its fleet led to the breakup of the British colonial empire that the fleet was needed to hold together. And look at what happened today, nearly 70 years later. This is a pretty profound thing to be saying in 1957. It's obvious to us now. All right. This is the epoch of American imperialism. It is not by chance that the United States has repeated at the expense of Europe the strategic maneuver first deployed by the Portuguese in the 15th century. By cutting off the sea route for trade between Europe and Asia, and everyone knows that the Suez Canal would not have been shut down if Nasser had not enjoyed U.S. support against England. The United States has Europe by the throat and has definitely destroyed any remaining British imperial traditions. We know this as dollar imperialism. This kind of imperialism that does not occupy territories. It even liberates those still under the yoke of colonialist rule, only to harness them to their own financial impotence. This is what can be seen as the irony of decolonization, which is you are liberated from one form of imperialism, but because you're dependent on these deep water trade markets to survive and get the resources that you need, you are imperialized in other ways. And whoever controls this trade controls these empires. Empire is not a system of policies that one state's run. It is a global system that maintains a certain mode of production of which the central nation can move, although right now it's been the United States for about 100 years. And that is declining, no doubt about it. If anything's going to emerge in its as a global hegemon and in its wake is unseen and somewhat doubtful, but the promise of multipolarity is because these deep water trade routes are going to have to be monitored by people in the great powers, and other forms of trade, maybe land trade, etc., may become dominant once again. Now, we'll come back to that. All right. Which is guarded by the most powerful naval air flotilla in the world. American imperialism is the most pure expression of capitalist imperialism, as it occupies the seas in order to rule the land. It is not by chance that its power is based on aircraft carriers, in which all monstrous deviations of the capitalist machine industry, which severs all relation between the means of production and the producer, are concentrated. If the aeronauts absorb the greatest results of bourgeois science, the aircraft character is the point of confluence for all technological sectors in that they are the vanguard of the proud march of the ruling class. Those who are so impressed by Russian imperialism that they forgot the tremendous force for domination and oppression represented by U.S. power run the risk of falling victims to democratic and liberal deviations, which are the worst enemies of Marxism. It is no accident that liberal democratic preaching has its leading pulpit in the headquarters of the greatest imperialist power of our times. Its disciples do not see that Russia, whose expansionism still assumes a form of colonialism as occupation of territories of weaker states, is still at a lower stage of imperialism, the imperialism of land armies. That is the type that has twice been defeated in the world wars. Having said this, over the definition of Russia has not changed in the slightest. It's a capitalist state. that he's talking about the USSR, and he's not calling it the USSR for a reason. This is very provocative in the 50s. It is just more evidence for the correctness of our definition. All existing states are enemies of the proletariat and of the communist revolution, but they are not all equally powerful. What matters above for the proletariat that will see the states of the world in alliance against it, should it ever have taken the first step in the conquest of power, is be conscious of the power of its most dangerous enemy, the one that is most heavily armed and capable of carrying its offensive to any part of the world. And that is a lot more obvious to everyone today in 2024 as things decline, ironically, this hour of Minerva shitting on everybody, than it was in 1955, 57, although it was beginning to be obvious then too. The form of imperialism that relies primarily on land forces was precisely that of feudalism. I think this is a little easy of an equation, but it is, the land stuff is important here. This does not mean that the imperialist powers that are less well endowed with this respect to naval forces are more likely to be dominated by future feudal traditions. For if it were true, then Japan would have reached, at the outbreak of the Second World War, a higher stage of capitalism than Germany, since the Japanese Navy had much more battle experience than the German Navy. It only means that in confrontation between imperialist powers or between would-be imperialist powers, the winner is the power that possesses the largest navy. This is a factor that, with regard to the goals of the preservation of capitalism and its capacities for repression, possesses greatest importance. With this in mind, what contemporary world power would engage in police operations anywhere in the world if not the one that possesses the largest forces and the greatest mobility? Russia, you say? Not even the Hungarians' events, and this is referring to the Hungarian revolt. The Russian repression in Hungary in November 1956 seemed to have confirmed upon it the certificate of leading the gendarme of the world counter-revolution. Actually, the task can only be carried out by the United States, that is, by the aircraft carrier imperialism. More precisely, by 100 aircraft carriers. The United States Navy has 103 naval air platforms, upon which 5,000 aircraft can be based, according to Il Topo, including fighters and fighter bombers and several hundred helicopters. Within a few months, the naval shipyards of New York and Newport will deliver the U.S. Navy 3 more gigantic aircraft carriers, the Ranger, the Independence, and the Kitty Hawk. Another aircraft carrier of the same class, the Forrestal class, is being built in the New York shipyard. These ships, currently the largest ships in the Navy, in any Navy in the world, are each 113 meters long, each had the capacity of 100 planes, and have a minimum speed of 35 knots, and with each crew member numbering 3,360 enlisted men and 466 officers. How much did the Forrestal cost? $218 million. That's in 1957 money, people. Are 130.8 trillion lira. These ships will be surpassed in respect to their size and capacities by the supercarriers of the NAAC, the Nuclear Attack Aircraft Carrier class, which will displace 85,000 tons as opposed to 60,000 tons of the Forrestal class ships, and will be 400 meters long and each powered by 8 nuclear turbines, with which we will attain speed and range of operations never before achieved by any naval vessels. Finally, the supercarriers of the NAAC class will be armed with radio-guided missiles. We can only imagine what will become of the machine of domination and war with the defense budgets announced by Eisenhower, now that has the U.S. has not only pledged economic aid to the Middle East, which it will have to accept sooner or later, but also has courteously offered to defend the nations of the Middle East should they require, whether they like it or not, its benevolent military existence, which led to the stuff that led to the 1980s, 90s, and aughts wars in the Middle East, guys. This starts with Ike's decision here. History has never witnessed before such a power of overwhelming strength permanently garrisoning the oceans. Aircraft carrier imperialism is the last great redoubt of the ruling class that does not understand the meaning of the word death. It is this imperialism that the proletarian revolution will have to fight its decisive battle, and thus the Leninist thesis of the world revolution obtained a brilliant clarity, and the treating of pseudo-doctrines of the national world to socialism would merely collapse. The bourgeoisie cannot be beaten one nation at a time, state by state, but only by a revolution that affects the whole continents and by a way of insurrectionary embrace of the proletarians on all frontiers. What chance of survival would a revolutionary state of the proletariat take in one or another part of the world, as long as American imperialism was in position to wield from anywhere to the oceans its shocking weapons of destruction. In order to shatter the repressive power of the capitalists, the proletariat will have to rise in arms on the world scale against the ruling class. There is only one road to socialism, the international and communist road. American imperialism, with its 100 aircraft carriers, is not only mounting guard for its national security, it is mounting guard for the capitalist privilege in every part of the world, anywhere that the proletariat represents a threat to the survival of the bourgeoisie. And why, if it faces a class enemy, has a united defense, should the proletariat be split up in its own forces and frameworks of various nations? The magnificent American Navy, which is today the terror of the world, will be transformed into a pile of scrap metal if the volcano of the revolution erupts again. The fire will have to break out in all nations and all continents, however, in Europe and Asia and Africa, but especially in America. Then we shall see what becomes of the nuclear-powered supercarrier when the crew hoists a red flag. We cannot say that we will not have to wait a long time to see this happen, but we are sure that we will not see it at all if the vanguards of the proletariat do not acquire the correct idea of capitalist imperialism. Bordiga, 1947. This is why I talk about imperialism, but also push back on so many strange and varied notions that encourage capitalist ideas and ideas of an imperial struggle from the capitalists themselves. We can learn from them. We can understand from them. That is not our goal and never should be. Keep that in mind whenever you're talking about this or that multipolar this, that whoever dominates the seas and the trades, and if they do it by boat, ship, or by bomb from the sky, that is where the imperial core lies. And you can't just fight it on its periphery. You also have to fight it in its core. And that battle will be both political and not. And it must be international or it is doomed. And that is all. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell.